Hi, I'm Devin Stewart here at Carnegie Council in New York City, and today I'm speaking with Ian Bremmer. He is president of the Eurasia Group here in New York, and today we're speaking about Eurasia Group's top 10 risks, political risks, for 2018 and their ethical implications. Ian, so good to have you back. Now, it is the 10th anniversary of this little show that we've done.
Which is nice.
10 times in a row, 10 years. People always talk about your socks in these shows. They're really expecting a lot from the socks. But this time, they're covered in boots.
That's, I'm sorry about that. Look, the only
You're
way
a
we're
sock
going
guy.
the only way we're going to resolve that clearly is getting rid of the boots, and that's okay. I don't want to upset. After 10 years, you deserve better. Those are the socks.
We
It's
need a
serious.
good show.
I've got a serious sock game for you. The only other person we've done 10 years in a row for, Brian Lehrer. And it was quite something to realize that it's been, and you do something for 10 years, you got to be doing something right? So look, at the end of the day, glad to be here.
It's so good to see you, Ian.
Yep.
And a good friend of Carnegie Council. So another anniversary is Eurasia Group has turned 20 years old. Happy birthday to Eurasia Group. And it's a milestone. Looking back on 20 years of running a political risk company,
Yeah.
what's the biggest takeaway that you've sort of reflected on?
I think if you want to do, 20 years does feel like a long time. If you told me 20 years ago this is what I'd be doing and it would be where it is today, I'm not sure I would have really bought that. But I can honestly tell you in 2018, I am happier and more excited about what I'm doing in the world and what we're doing as an organization than I ever have been before. And I think there are two reasons for that. The first is as you build an organization and you learn what you're good at and what you're not good at, what you like and what you don't like, you actually should be taking some lessons away and getting that done. So I think I have a CEO. I don't run the company. I have no interest in running a big consulting firm. That's never why I started. I'm a political scientist. Over time, you make decisions that allow you to get there. And also because, not only is the world getting more complicated and more volatile, and we'll talk about that, but also that, it's getting more challenging to understand what's happening in the world. The impact is growing, and we all know that you only operate at a high level when something is challenging, when something reflects the work and the expertise you've done, but also you're motivated to. Right? It's what they call flow state, right? If you're playing against someone that's going to kill you, or you're playing sports against someone that is no good, you are not trying. But when you need to have that stretch goal, it works. And I think that where we are today and the kind of challenges that the world puts in front of us, it really allows us to operate at a pretty high level most of the time.
Political risk is your avenue to a flow state?
I think trying to understand the world
Yeah.
and trying to bring some of that knowledge to a broader global public, which is frankly not so different from what we do here at the Carnegie Council, is absolutely what I wouldn't call myself a consultant. I think I'm a political scientist.
That's good.
Yeah.
Now, in 20 years, your new report, 2018 Top Risks report, is saying some pretty dramatic stuff. You're saying it's probably the most dangerous geopolitical environment you've ever seen in those 20 years. You also say that globally our luck may be running out for world stability. A big crisis is possible this year. And you've warned of a geopolitical depression, which is different from a recession.
Yeah.
Why are you so alarmed? And what would a geopolitical depression look like? What would cause it?
But let me give you some good news before I answer that.
Okay.
Because, we know, before you read my report, we know that the Dow's at 25,000 and new records every day. We know that unemployment is relatively low. We like American growth. We like global growth. And actually, 2018 looks like it's exceeding earlier IMF estimates in most parts of the world. That's fantastic.
And the markets and the geopolitics
Are separate.
They don't
And
talk
they
to
should
each
be.
other?
Well,
What are
they talk to each other, but I mean, they don't necessarily listen to each other, right? And the cycles.
They're married, but they don't talk.
Well, I don't know. They're not necessarily married. The geopolitical and geoeconomic cycles are different. So when the last time we had a horrible economic crisis was 10 years ago, 2008 financial crisis. And if you were to ask me back when we did the 2009 political risk report, the global risk report, we thought the politics looked pretty good. In fact, I would say that in 2009, the principal leaders of the world's most important economies were more aligned to get us out of that recession than they have been at any point since.
Right.
So no, the politics and the economics are not always moving in concert. Frequently, they're not. So that's the good news. The good news is that all of this geopolitical concern is happening absent an economic meltdown. In fact, it's happening in a period of comparative economic robustness. But
And you think that will be maintained?
not clear.
Not clear. Okay.
Because of the nature of potential crises. I mean, if the crisis gets bad enough, we already know that oil prices have bumped up towards 70 in the last week. And that's clearly geopolitically driven on the back of Iran instability, crackdown, Iran versus Saudi Arabia, and Trump's response in effectively supporting regime change on the ground in Tehran. Now, if that gets worse, then energy prices could go up. Great for Saudi Arabia, not good for the global economy, clearly. So, and if we were to incinerate a few million Koreans, and the possibility of that in 2018 is higher than at any other point that you and I have spoken, I promise you the markets are going to go down. That's not our principal concern.
Right.
Our principal concern is that you're incinerating a few million Koreans. But yes, the markets would definitely be impacted by that. The thing is that the markets, when I say that there is a heightened chance of crisis, indeed a crisis looks increasingly likely. Because when you're in a recession, whether it's an economic or a political recession, you either have to fix it, work to fix it, or it's likely to get worse. And I got to tell you, sitting here in 2018, looking at the geopolitical recession, it is much more likely that we are not going to fix it and it's going to get worse. When you look at Trump, Theresa May, constellation of Europeans, Putin, Xi Jinping, we non-state actors, we do not have the formula, the desire, the political will, the political capacity to get us out of this geopolitical recession for the foreseeable future. And given the number of things that could go wrong, that really implies to me that we're going to have a crisis or two. Yeah, so when I look at 2018 from a geopolitical lens, and I am actually filled with some foreboding. Yes.
If we're in a geopolitical depression, how do we know we're in one?
Well,
what are the signs?
Major wars, right? I mean, trade war, tech war, war. And certainly, I mean, there are a lot of people writing about the Thucydides trap, the fact that the United States and China might end up at loggerheads with each other. I don't believe a military war is in any way likely, but I think a technology war between the two is increasingly likely.
Right.
And I think that has a big impact on the world.
A lot of those are on your risks, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Before we get to your risks, though, I wanted to check in with you on the White House, what you think about the White House. You had a very dramatic statement last year when we met.
Yeah.
When we met last year, I asked you, tell me about your assessment of 8 years of the Obama administration. Your description was it was a moral failure, ethical failure. It's pretty stark.
Yeah.
Now, in moral terms, what would you make of the first year of the Trump White House, the Trump presidency? Do you agree that it's a values-free administration, as some people have called it?
I mean, there clearly are values. I think that the big difference between Trump and really any president that we've seen in the modern era, including Nixon, is that Trump is primarily thinking almost completely about his personal legacy and the legacy of his family, or at least much of his family, and not the legacy of the country. And I think that when you line that up with that of other political leaders around the world, particularly of major economies, it's enormously problematic for the maintenance and the sustenance of American influence globally. The lack of interest, the indifference of President Trump to liberal democratic institutions, to the architecture globally that has been built by the United States, to rule of law, to separation of powers, to a free and open media. We've never seen anything like that before. You know, it's kind of interesting. As you know, I believe that we're passing through a G0 world,
Right.
with an absence of leadership. But it is instructive to note that in a world that has so little leadership, where so few things bring the world together, one of the few things that we've found that can bring the world together in 2018 is Trump. I mean, if you talk about him pulling out of the Paris climate deal, literally every other country in the world supports the Paris climate deal.
Yep.
So, I mean, he was literally able to bring the entire world together. That is hard to do. UNESCO, pulling out of UNESCO, he literally drove the rest of the world together. Iran, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and Israel, maybe the Emiratis, he's literally brought the entire world together in opposing what he is saying and in principle what he is trying to do. And if you want to talk about the potential for further dramatic erosion of American influence in the world, you'd be hard-pressed to find a president that would be better suited than Donald Trump to accomplish that.
You mentioned at the beginning of your answer that Trump does have some values that he's promoting, and I'm hearing what you're saying is the values that he's promoting are himself.
Yeah, sure.
Are there other values, loyalty or compliance or anything else that you feel that the administration, which values he, because his people claim to be the true realists, right?
Pragmatic realists. Pragmatic realism is
true?
what they have written about. Well, if you're asking me about Trump, you're getting a different answer than the administration, and I think it's smarter to ask about the administration because the U.S. government is not just one person, never has been. He's massively constrained in what he can and can't accomplish, and that's true for even very strong presidents, and Trump is not a very strong president. When I look at the constellation of the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, when I look at the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, I look at the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, I look at the head of the National Economic Council, Gary Cohn. These are all people that I believe do think of themselves as pragmatic realists. They do believe that Henry Kissinger is kind of iconic in helping to think about how America should move in the world. They do believe the United States can be overly constrained and played by its allies if it is not looking out for its own interests more directly and more consistently. I do believe that this administration as a whole is more tactical than strategic, in that many of the important international institutions that the Americans have signed up for or tried to sign up for, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, are pragmatically realistic if you think about the long term. The big problem that Americans have both politically and in our marketplace is that we tend to focus on short-termism. You know, quarterly returns for a CEO, 5 years at best to be stewarding a major multinational organization, election cycles every 2 years for the House of Representatives, every 4 for the president. The election takes 1.5 to 2 years. You have, you know, a 6-month window to really get things done in many of these cases, right? So I do think that when you couple that with a number of people around Trump that are trying to do a good job for American national interests but are really thinking narrowly, when you're up against the Chinese in particular,
Right.
who actually see a much broader sweep of history, don't have to worry about these elections, don't have separation of powers, it does cede to them an awful lot of ground.
Yep.
And I think that that is an enormous concern in 2018.
Well, let's get to your top 10 risks for 2018. I'd like to talk about at least 5 of them, given the time.
Sure.
Let's start with risk number 5. You put U.S.-Iran relations as risk number 5 for
Yep.
2018. And I get the sense from your report that you and your team believe that maybe Trump has it out for Iran. Why? I mean, why is it that Trump seems to have something like a vendetta against Iran? Is it the hangover from the Carter years, or is it?
No, he doesn't think about the Carter years. I've never heard him once mention Carter in a tweet. I mean, maybe he did once, but generally no.
It seems like he gets a lot of his ideas from the 70s and 80s, and so just wondering if it's something from before.
I think he gets a lot of things from the 70s and 80s, but that's a different story. Certainly the design sense of Trump properties is from the 70s
Right.
and 80s. No, but when I think about Iran, I think there are 2 really relevant points here. The first is that Obama did a deal on Iran.
Right.
Which Trump has been critical of. Trump has done his damnedest to try to unwind much of what the Obama administration has done. Obamacare, a very big piece of this internationally. Iran has probably been the most significant piece that he wants to unwind. Secondarily, and quite unusually, uniquely, President Trump's first visit outside of the United States as president was first to Riyadh and then to Tel Aviv. And of course, we are now talking about a president who cares a great deal and has developed better relations than Obama, probably maybe even better relations than Hillary Clinton might have, with the Saudis and the Israelis. Yes, 2 important American allies in the region, but obviously the primary enemies of Iran globally. Add to that Jared Kushner's personal views on Israel, personal sense of enmity towards Iran. I think that gets you at least 90% towards understanding where Trump has been on Iran. But again, he is being advised by a constellation of fairly intelligent to quite intelligent people on the national security front who have been telling him tactically, pragmatic realism, hey, do not kill this nuclear deal, whatever you say about it, because we'll be all by ourselves. And so far, and I expect this to continue, though there's no guarantees, I think that he is going to continue to be reluctant to solely rip up that deal. He's instead been punting it to Congress, and Congress has shown no inclination to take any further responsibility.
So you think that despite his sort of antagonism toward Iran, the deal could survive?
I hope so, because the alternative is much worse. Look, I think that, again, there is a heightened risk that the deal goes under from what it was a year ago before Trump. Part of that is Trump. Part of that is Iranian demonstrations and hardline response to crush them over the last 2 weeks, which they've been successfully doing. And part of it is a more challenging environment for the Iranians economically, because there's still a lot of sanctions that have been maintained, and in the region, because they're fighting a lot of proxy wars against the Saudis and others. Both the potential for proxy wars to expand, for confrontation between the U.S. and Iran to become more dramatic, I think is clearly escalated in 2018, and the potential for the Iranian nuclear deal to be ripped up by the Americans and maybe the Iranians to restart their nuclear programs. And then we're talking by the end of the year about Israeli strikes, American strikes. That's also very real. So for all of those reasons, U.S.-Iran was not number 1. It wasn't number 2, but you started with number 5. It deserves to be number 5.
What do you make of the protests in Iran? It's all over the country. The press is attributing it to resentment against corruption, disappointment since the nuclear deal. Are there any other factors there that are driving these protests?
Yes, there's one more, which is that the Saudi government has been reforming or attempting to reform quite a bit to open up its society. The Iranians have always been very proud that they are civilized, that they have a lot of diversity, that women have rights, and the Saudis are, backwater oil monarchy. So to the extent that you now have a young, charismatic crown prince in Saudi Arabia that's saying we're going to reform Islam, we're going to give women the ability to drive, we're going to improve our educational system. A lot of Iranians are looking at their own government, which they see to be more kleptocratic. They're getting more transparency around that process. and they're saying we want more. But you're still talking about a grassroots movement with thousands of people, 1,000 arrested. In 2009, the Green Revolution, you were talking about millions of people with a leader.
Right.
They know there are leaders of the opposition in Iran, but if they get found out, they're going to be executed. And so it's really hard to move the needle to create instability against the Iranian regime at this point, whatever the Americans say notwithstanding.
Let's go to risk number 4, Ian.
Are we going to do? Are we going? Are we
we're going to go
building
down
up to 1? Is
five,
that what we're
5,
doing?
4, 3, 2,
We're
1,
building
yeah.
up. We're going up. Down or up?
We're going from 5 to 4. I believe risk number 4 is Mexico.
Right. Yeah,
right?
we're going up. We're
Okay.
moving towards the top risk.
Correct. Yes.
Up. Definitely up.
I think of countdown.
Oh,
5, 4.
countdown.
You're right. I didn't
okay,
think of
but
that
we're
way.
but we're working towards blast off.
You're right.
Yes.
You're right. Going up.
I feel good about
Up
this.
and down.
Okay. That's way too exciting for this conversation. I just want to let you know.
Great
I know,
socks,
especially
by the way.
because my
The
socks are already.
those
this
are
is trouble.
Game-changing
This
socks.
is trouble. Okay,
Game-changing.
go for it. So we're on Mexico.
I think risk
You and
number
I.
3 has something to do with socks.
Yes, it's true.
So 4 is Mexico.
Yes.
NAFTA is the sort of centerpiece there. If NAFTA cannot be renegotiated, it only adds to uncertainty around the presidential elections taking place.
The Canadian government has said today that they think it is more likely than not that Trump triggers the 6-month withdrawal countdown on NAFTA. They still don't think that the U.S. withdraws, but that's a very negative sign, and obviously in line with what we had to say in the report. I am deeply concerned about the implications of that trigger. The U.S. has never left a multilateral trade deal before.
Right.
Many in Congress and outside Congress will argue and will litigate that the president does not have the legal right to make that decision unilaterally. As you know, when lawyers get involved in the U.S., things get very messy, a lot of uncertainty. And all this is happening as the Mexicans are gearing up for elections, where López Obrador, who is no fan of the United States, has a damn good shot of winning, and has a better shot of winning if NAFTA looks problematic because of Trump, if the wall some piece of it is getting built and Trump still says they have to pay for it. The rise of anti-Americanism in Mexico will be a very big deal. In 20 years, we have never considered Mexico to be a top risk before. This is the first time. First time.
Well, and the Canadians also are in the process of filing a WTO lawsuit, a suit against the United States about using tariffs to against dumping accusations, right? So there's a lot of tension between the 3 members of NAFTA.
The Trump-Trudeau personal relationship is actually pretty good, and I think that despite the fact that the first trade actual move against any other country that Trump took was against Canada, the softwood lumber tariffs, which targeted small. There were a lot of Democrats that actually agreed with the underlying statement there. But still, that's interesting. Then, of course, more recently, you have the Bombardier case, also very big tariffs being put against them, which will affect their business model. But the U.S.-Canada political relationship all the way through the bureaucracy and at the top levels is still pretty darn functional. So that's why we didn't say Canada and Mexico. We said Mexico. This is really a Mexico problem.
And if Obrador is elected, what should we expect?
I think it's pretty likely he is at this point. I'd probably say it's more than 50%. Because, in many countries you have a 2-round system. And so if you have some guy that's a bit of a wingnut, he can get into the second round, but then all of the moderates consolidate against whoever won from the other side, and the moderate wins. In Mexico, it's a 1-round system, which means that López Obrador, he can get 25% as long as he beats everybody else. He's president, right? And this is a nearly ideal political context for López Obrador to be running.
Thanks to Trump, in part.
In part, there are other things as well. I mean, look, certainly President Peña Nieto in Mexico, big problems with corruption, big problems with security, murders, kidnapping rates, the rest all going up across Mexico. There's a wonderful dystopian piece in the front page of the New York Times just a week ago about how 3 different towns in Mexico have effectively gone off the political grid and are governing themselves. One with a new party system, one with a corporatist environment. They're just paying for their own policing, doing their own social contracts, because the government and the police and the militia cannot be trusted and can't get anything done. That's disturbing
Wow.
in a country directly to the south of our border, and that's the kind of environment where a much more anti-establishment candidate is more likely to win.
Let's go to risk 3, Ian. You point to a very important topic that's been actually described on several Capitol Hill hearings recently.
Yeah.
And it's you're pointing to, you're calling it a global tech Cold War.
Correct.
And it's between the United States and China.
Right.
Those are the combatants, if you will.
Yes.
And the difference, and you point this out in some of your reports, is that in the difference between China and the United States is that the technology sector, whether it's AI or robotics or cybersecurity, those things are backed by the state in China.
Yep.
In the United States, it's backed by the private sector.
Right.
And that means they have different goals, different interests.
One's unified, one's fragmented.
Fragmented,
Right.
and not and the private sector might not necessarily sympathize with the government, especially
Or even with the
Silicon
country.
Valley.
Or even with the country. I
Right.
mean, ultimately, if you're a Chinese corporation, you're patriotic. If you're an American corporation, you get a better tax deal someplace else, you move, unless you're stopped.
Yeah.
Right? So, look, I think that one thing that's very important about this risk is that in 2018, I really think that we can say that China is a tech superpower.
Yeah.
They really are. They are a global tech superpower. And they weren't 5 years ago. If you look at the 500 top supercomputers in the world, more are Chinese than American. You look at what China's doing with big data and how much more of it they have, not only given the size of the population, but also given the scale of state intrusion into their lives, it's greater. They are dominant in drone technology. They're dominant in industrial robotics. America has better AI scientists. We have better universities. We're more entrepreneurial. There are other areas that we're clearly leading, but it's a fight. And it's not clear who's going to win. But on the military side...
You have a bet, though? Who's gonna win?
No, I don't.
No.
I'll get to that in a second. On the military side, the Chinese are only regional. There's no war. They will get crushed. On the economic side, we're completely interlinked. So if we really start hitting each other, we're both going to get huge black eyes, right?
Right.
On the tech side, we're actually truly competitors and we're not interlinked. The systems are increasingly separate.
Right.
They're zero sum. Right. And so who's going to win? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I will tell you what will inform the answer. Is if it turns out that, and by the way, this is probably the most important question in the world. Vladimir Putin and Elon Musk don't agree on much, but they both believe that whoever dominates AI is going to dominate the global system.
Sounds right.
And so we need to know who's going to win this war. There's really only two combatants. It's Silicon Valley and it's Beijing. If it turns out that AI is more like the Manhattan Project, in other words, is it really just about computing power and people working on that issue, then I think the Chinese will win because they will be able to devote the most resources at one big moonshot.
Right.
If it turns out that AI is more like how do you fix climate change, a lot of dead ends, cold fusion doesn't work, solar kind of does,
Fragmented.
we don't know about battery technology, then I think the Americans win because we're just much better at creative destruction. And I don't think we know where the ultimate AI breakthrough is going to come from. But I think that we do increasingly agree, all the scientists, mostly, 80, 90% of the scientists really believe that over the course of a next generation or so, we're going to have fundamental breakthroughs in AI that will change the global power environment. Yeah.
And what you're a little circumspect about what China can actually do with this technology. For example, is it going to promote non-interference or authoritarian values? I mean, what aside from going to cyber war,
Yeah.
What can China do with this technology?
I don't know that they're
affect
going
the
to
game?
promote authoritarianism, but they're going to show that authoritarianism works more effectively. And there will be an awful lot of people around the world that find that compelling. you see. I mean,
Yeah.
if you have a government that is able to incent certain types of behavior incredibly effectively, because everybody's online and everyone wants to ensure that they get goodies from the state and don't get punished, that creates an enormous capacity to ensure political stability without providing liberties that are
Right.
threatening to a one-party state.
Like the social credit system. And
For
other things.
example, very compellingly, and I think that's a concern.
It occurred to me that reading your list, you could have described the Soviet Union and the United States as also being in a tech Cold War as well, because of just different types of technologies that were at stake, satellites and nuclear weapons. It's just kind of interesting how history does kind of rhyme a little bit like
It's
that.
true, though, I mean, to be clear, when we were talking about the Americans and the Soviets, we were talking about things that were really all technologies that were housed clearly within the military-industrial complex. Where when we're talking about technology and AI, at least so far, that's not true. And now, it may be that in 20 years, there is a military technology complex, which is completely different, and it's focused on AI.
Right.
I have my doubts that the Americans will be able to do that.
Risk number 2, Ian, is accidents, broadly speaking, and that's almost the epitome of a risk, right? An accident. What's different? My understanding, what's different now is there's no one to manage the flare-ups. There's, as you said, a G0 world. It's a leaderless world.
Right.
So you put it, there's no guardrails to sort of manage the accidents. And then you write that, let's talk about North Korea. War with North Korea is, quote, more thinkable today than it has ever been. And that might be, you might have moderated that view, I'm not sure, but let's talk about the accident that's possible with North Korea. So as you know, the South and the North Koreans are talking about competing with one another in the Winter Olympics. They've reestablished the hotline, and they're talking, seems very cordially now, over the DMZ. What do you make of this current version of the rapprochement between those two countries? I mean, we've seen this happen before. Some of the press is acting like this is, the first time this has ever happened. This happens every 10 or so years.
Yeah, but it is a big deal, and Trump deserves both some credit and some blame for it. Some credit because sanctions are tougher now against North Korea, and Trump did push that effectively with the Chinese.
And Moon gave him credit.
Yes, and but also problematically because why did North Korea start testing the ICBM so quickly? Because they want to respond with a strong deterrent against Trump.
Of course.
So I mean, you can go both ways. But the way I talked about this before the top risk piece came out was that we had an environment on North Korea where the status quo was pretty stable, but it was getting incrementally worse every year. Now we have a situation where the status quo is considerably less stable, and there is a greater chance of a breakthrough and a diplomatic resolution than there was. And there's also a greater chance of war. And I don't know which of those scenarios you prefer, the status quo ante that's changing or the risk of breakthrough or war, but clearly the reason why many presidents have addressed this and decided, you know what, I'm going to leave this one for another president, is because the perceived downside of escalating the disaster scenario, no one thought was worth it. Trump thinks is worth it. And the potential, I don't think that Trump's advisors are seriously considering a preemptive strike, but I think they're seriously preparing that wargaming. The punch in the nose, where you don't do a decapitation strike, but you hit them and they know that if they hit you back, that they're completely gone. But I think the potential of you having that kind of strike on the basis of miscalculations from an ICBM test that the Americans shoot down, or that sort of disintegrates and hits a boat or hits Japanese over the mainland, or you name it, right? I mean, those things are vastly more dangerous now. And I do not feel that downside is adequately mitigated by the fact that the South and North Koreans are going to be meeting together in a few weeks' time at the Olympics.
What about the scenario of a sort of equilibrium where the United States and North Korea just sort of reach a sort of peaceful nuclear deterrence? Is that possible?
Of course, it's possible, and again, I would consider that a close to a breakthrough. If you could basically say, look, stop testing, we'll
Right.
stop our military exercises with the South Koreans, the freeze for freeze that the Chinese talk about.
Right.
We will tolerate the fact that you're a nuclear power. We're going to reduce your sanctions. You're going to allow an inspections regime. I mean, that sounds like an Iranian deal. It ain't denuclearization.
Right.
It's not a path to denuclearization. The North Koreans will have functioning ICBMs at that point. That would be a breakthrough. And again, Trump, his willingness to completely pivot 180 from whatever he said before, if something useful is in front of him that he can take credit for, that makes this possible. And the fact that Trump doesn't care about human rights. So he's not going to have the hang-ups over meeting with Kim Jong-un for a cheeseburger the way that other presidents would. So it makes it more likely. But the potential that he gets into a meeting and he says something or tweets something or gets angry and the whole thing blows up is also real. So again, it's the uncertainty, it's the volatility, it's the fact that very few people around the world consider this presidency to be one they can trust, that they can rely on, makes the likelihood of a lot of these risks considerably more problematic.
And we also don't know what would happen after, if a nuclear deterrence sort of equilibrium was achieved. We don't know what the North Koreans would want to do with it. That's the other problem.
Well, I mean, I think we kind of know that they want to be treated in a more esteemed way. So the fact that they would be recognized nuclear power, the fact that they would no longer be in a state of war.
You don't think they would want to force a unification?
No, I don't think that a reunification in this environment is plausible. The cost, the governance issues, I mean, make that really a moonshot. And I don't mean South Korean variety. But look, I still think the most likely outcome over North Korea is a deteriorating status quo. But I think it's much more likely than it was that we go to war. And if it was 1%, it's now 10 or 20%. And that's not just true in North Korea. That's true in Iran. That's true with all of the combatants around Syria. That it is also true that in reaction to a terrorist attack against Americans, the United States won't rally around the flag. It'll be much more divisive. It'll be much more targeted against Muslim citizens in the United States. Same thing with cyber attacks. The divisiveness in the United States, the lack of guardrails, the lack of resilience, means that when crises occur that are political, they are likely to have much greater impact on the geopolitical balance than they would have 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even 1 year ago.
Your top risk for 2018 is China loves a vacuum, like outer space, not the appliance. And what you mean by that is, as Trump sort of accelerates a G0 world and a leadership vacuum, China is more and more willing to step into the void. And I think the Xi Jinping's speech at the 19th Party Congress, which was high-profile speech, is evidence of a change of mindset, at least, right? What do you think China wants to do with this new ambition for a global role?
Clearly, the most important thing is he wants to create standards, align countries more with Chinese standards that gives them influence, that allows them to promote their commercial interests more effectively. The Chinese government has talked about the fact that there are 3 different types of corporations. You have corporations that create products, they're the lowest level. You have corporations that create brands, they're the medium level. And the corporations that create standards are the highest level. That's clearly true of governance as well. China's getting bigger and their leaders getting stronger, but they still would have waited to have the public willingness to accept leadership and responsibility if it wasn't for Trump. And they understand that even though in 5 or 10 years they'll be stronger, there's never going to be a global opportunity for having a much bigger footprint without pushback as there is right now with America First.
Right, right.
Because this is the time when other countries, even major American allies, are looking at the U.S. saying, whoa, maybe we need to look at Beijing more. Whoa, we can't count on these guys. This is really dangerous. And
Right.
that clearly plays out when Trump says no to the TPP and Trump pulls out of Paris and Trump does what he does in all of these other areas. The Chinese get to be the responsible, pro-status quo-ish power as long as you do what Beijing wants. And doing what Beijing wants is very different than historically doing what the United States wants, particularly on the economic side. And I think that that is the biggest game changer. In my life, there have been two speeches that are game changers geopolitically. One was when Gorbachev declared the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. The second was Xi Jinping's 19th Party plenary speech. And what I think is so interesting about that latter is that it was not recognized as such here in the United States. It was everywhere else, but not in the United States. The Americans are still like, la, 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 we're still in charge. And the problem is Trump. We think in America, we think the problem is Trump. Get rid of Trump, our leadership's coming back. No, Pax Americana is over. It's not coming back. I'm not saying that China's going to be the global leader. I don't necessarily believe that. I certainly hope that's not the case. But we will not return to American indispensability and exceptionalism. That's not going to happen. And that's clear after 1 year of Trump. Never mind 4 or 8, right? So this is a pretty dramatic sea change in the way we think about the world. I think that in 10 and 20 years, let's assume that we're still doing this in another 10 years' time. I'll wear socks that you can see. We will look back on that speech as the tipping point,
Pivotal.
as pivotal towards the emergence of a different post-American world order. I think so.
Let's talk real quickly about things that didn't make the list.
Yeah.
And these are things that probably make up at least 60% of American media coverage.
Like?
Trump's tweets.
Yeah.
White House intrigue.
Yeah.
Russia investigation.
Yeah.
As illuminated by a book I just finished reading and you just
Fire
read
and
too.
Fury.
Fire and Fury.
Love it.
By Michael Wolff. He's a neighbor of yours.
He is a neighbor of mine.
I just finished it yesterday.
Okay.
Are we collectively, are we paying attention to the wrong stuff? Is this all distraction? Is this entertainment? While we should be looking at things like the things that are on your
I mean,
risks?
it depends on who's we.
Right.
As my mother would say, do you have a rat in your pocket? I mean, we. The average American feels that politics are not useful to them, and if they're watching, it's meant as entertainment or as supporting their own pre-baked convictions, right? And so, I mean, in that regard, the fact that what we're consuming are headlines that are completely ephemeral. They go away in a day, but they make me say, "Love Trump," or they make me say, "What an asshole." That's that is what we're oriented towards.
Right.
Now,
like sports.
But if we're talking, it is like sports. It's absolutely like sports. It's as meaningless as sports. Trump's tweets are almost as meaningless as sports. They are used by people for their own political purposes in a way that sports are not.
Right.
I'm not talking about World Cup stuff.
Well, there's NFL. There's an NFL which was used.
There was that. That's true. No, he's using sports.
Right. He's
yes.
using sports.
And effectively
Right.
for his base. That was one of the smarter things he did from a narrow political perspective. I mean, 70% black players, mostly white fans. How dare these millionaires that we allow to make money desecrate our national anthem? I mean, the identity politics stuff there was very clear and put a lot of pressure on the NFL, frankly. But so he knows how to manipulate that stuff. But if you ask me, do the tweets matter for policy? Do they really create greater risks? I mean, look, Fire and Fury has sold over 1 million copies. It will be the most sold and talked about book of any presidency in history. And yet, all it basically says is Trump isn't fit to be president. And here's a whole bunch of people that say that.
Yeah.
We all knew that when we voted for him.
Is it credible? Do you think it's a credible account?
80% to 90%, I think, is probably right on the basis of the people I talked to in the White House and outside. Sure. But the point is, we knew all of this.
Right.
Right. All this is more grist for a mainstream media mill that is trying at all times to put out stuff that makes Trump look like a 2-year-old. And I did not spend any time in our top risk report trying to make Trump look like a 2-year-old, because I don't think that's relevant. We know that the American president only matters so much, that the administration matters a lot more. We know that most of the reason we're in a G0 has very little to do with the president, and that most of it that has to do with Trump is symptomatic of something structural that's been going on in the U.S. for a long time. It's much more important to understand how it was that someone like Trump could be elected, given that we knew everything about fire and fury before we elected him.
Right.
Right? I mean, this guy was one of the most open books, one of the most talked about characters, one of the most reviled and disputed and litigated against characters in American history.
For decades, sure.
For decades. And suddenly fire and fury is like, oh my God, he's not fit to be president.
Yeah.
Shocking.
Newsflash. Yeah.
Shocking. There's gambling happening in that casino. Shocking. It is not news. And I mean, God bless Michael Wolff for understanding the zeitgeist of the American public and profiting off it personally.
Yeah.
It does show that anyone with an idea and the right space in America can make it big. It is true. And that if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. Again, true. But in terms of actual impact on policy, no, this is about branding. This is about entertainment. This is a case study for how to work a system to promote yourself, which a lot of people today are very interested in. Very interested in.
That's true. Narcissism.
Narcissism. I mean, I think you'd be hard. I mean, when you look at Michael Wolff and Donald Trump together, and then add Steve Bannon to the mix, it's an extraordinary cocktail of narcissism, right? I mean, it's virtually unprecedented.
Well, speaking of great books, Ian, and we can conclude with this, and this has been wonderful speaking with you. You have yet another book.
The greatest book.
Coming out.
The greatest book ever.
It's going to be.
It's going to be the biggest brand.
Is it something and something, or is it something versus something? It's us versus them.
Us versus them. The failure of globalism.
The failure of globalism. Yeah. Wonderful. And it's going to be more fiery and more fury than ever.
It won't be as fire and fury or as gossipy as.
But I love the title. Us versus them. I get it.
It bothers me. I'm someone who fundamentally believes that I and we have more in common with people from all over the world than not, and that what unites us is humanity, not nation, not government, not the randomness of having been born in one place or to one religion. I fundamentally believe that, and if that is globalism, so be it. But I absolutely see that the people who have promoted an ideology of globalism in the past decades and the organizations that have failed miserably so many of their citizens, and they are not going to do anything about it, and that's what this book is about.
Very important and timely topic, Ian.
We'll see.
We just finished a project here that ended up producing a book called Ordinary Virtues by Michael Ignatieff. We came to a very similar conclusion. I think you're really tapping onto something, and I really look forward to seeing it. That's later this spring, right?
April 24th is the landing date, the drop date. Though if Trump tweets about it, we might push it a couple days.
Can't wait to read it.
I just want the cease and desist order. If someone can tell me how to figure that out, I swear to God, I'm there.
I'll put one out there for you.
Please do.
Put it on Twitter.
Please do.
Ian, thanks so much for today.
Yep.
Wonderful socks and wonderful discussion.
These are the best socks. The best socks. They're the best.
Happy 2018.
You too, man. Cheers.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That was fun.
That was fun.